Your Partner in Success Radio is a free business podcast with host Denise Griffitts. It's all about great stories, conversation, and context to help you move your business and life forward with actionable tips and advice from her guest experts. To listen and subscribe, just find us on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you consume your podcasts.
Good morning and welcome to Your Partner in Success Radio. I am your host, Denise Griffitts, and this podcast is ranked in the top 2% of the most popular podcasts globally. And it's not because of me. It's because of my truly incredible guests. I am honored and blessed to share time with people who are at the top of their game and who are willing to help you get to where you want to be in life and in business. These are not people who hold back. Their goal in coming on this show is to share with us the essence of peak performance. So today we are joined by Matt Atchity, and this is a man who has had an incredible career in the entertainment industry, excuse me, spanning roles at Rotten Tomatoes, TYT Network. I'll be honest, I'm not sure what that is. Moviefone and CNN. Those I've heard of. Matt, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today. You have had an incredible career in the entertainment industry, spanning roles at Rotten Tomatoes, the things that I just mentioned earlier. So tell our audience how you show up in the world. We're excited to hear your insights and perspectives on the entertainment world.
Oh, Denise, so glad to be here. I feel like I am extremely lucky. My first job, while I was still in high school, actually, was a tour guide at Universal Studios, where I sat in front of the tram and talked about movies and TV shows that were filmed on the lot, and basically got to geek out about movies and TV, which I always had loved doing. And to a certain extent, I feel like at the end of the day, my role at Rotten Tomatoes and at Moviefone and some other places, at the end of the day, I'm still telling people about cool movies and TV shows to go see, just in a different context. So it's been fun. I just kind of look for what are the cool opportunities and what's out there. And, I have been, like I said, very lucky. The job at Rotten Tomatoes was something actually I settled for, because I was trying to get a different job with the same company at MySpace, of all places. Right?
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because there are way too many of us right now go, MySpace, I remember that. That's where we started.
I saw that there was a role that was going to be someone to work at MySpace and interface with all the studios and secure content. And I had done that work when I was at Yahoo for a few years. And I really, really wanted that job. And they hired someone else, and I was really disappointed. But the guy I had talked to said, I think you'd be good for this job as editor-in-chief of Rotten Tomatoes. And at the time I was thinking like, okay. And it just goes to show you, like, I had what I thought was something I settled for turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to me. I spent 10 years with that team, really working on making that a household name and really expanding the influence of Rotten Tomatoes. I wish I could say that I was smart enough to be the one that founded the site. But I came in the site had been around for about 10 years. And I came in and fairly quickly, within the first year or so, my boss and I kind of cooked up this idea like, we could make this the authority. And so for the next few years, every move that we made within the company was, is this going to get us where we're looking to go? Right. We kind of set a sail by, and that's what we did. And it really informed our day-to-day decision-making. So I've always looked for, in a role for me, if I get a position in a company or if I'm starting a project, I'm not afraid to think big. To a certain extent, I kind of go with the attitude of why not? Why couldn't I do that? Sometimes it doesn't occur to me that I couldn't do a thing, whatever that goal is. And I'd rather find out by doing it that I can't do it than just giving up, if that makes sense.
It does. And listen, I'm with you. It's like, I will sometimes catch myself saying, Denise, I don't think you can do that. Instantly, my inner child says, yeah, watch me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, you can't, you're not the boss of me. So off I go. You sound like you're very much the same.
Yeah, with Rotten Tomatoes, it was interesting because I at the time, knew a lot about the movie business and knew a lot about production, or a fair amount, but I didn't know a lot about entertainment journalism. And part of the job at Rotten Tomatoes, because we spent a lot of time grabbing reviews and posting links to reviews from other sites, I was constantly looking at how the rest of the entertainment journalism's industry was covering movies and covering entertainment. And so it allowed me to take this kind of step back and look at it as a whole. And as I was doing that, when I first started, this was the time that, the late, great Roger Ebert was kind of slowing down on what he was doing. He, if you remember, he had cancer and couldn't really talk anymore. It ended up being this time for him to be really prolific in his writing, because that was kind of the only outlet he had to really communicate. But we knew he was sick because we would talk to him. We talked to a lot of the critics, and we knew that he was, at the time, we kind of thought he was going to retire soon. And at that time, my boss and I kind of discussed, that Roger Ebert's going to retire and there's going to be a void. There's going to be a void in a national level voice as to whether or not a movie is worth seeing or not, because Gene Siskel, his great partner, had already passed away. Leonard Maltin, who we also had talked to, had really, really dialed back the amount of criticism he was doing at the time. And there wasn't really any major like household name critic anymore. Or at least that was kind of winding down. And my boss and I thought, well, Rotten Tomatoes could fill that space. And so for the next 2 years, everything we did on the site was, as I mentioned before, is this going to get us to that goal? So it would be things like we would put together a list of movies as to, what are the best reviewed Oscar winners of all time. And so we will put that list together and we would rank those movies by their score on the Tomatometer. And then we would send that link out to everybody, all the other film journalists, in the hopes that they would pick it up and mention that. And we kept doing, strategies like that, among other things, to really cement that we were the authority on what was best. And it took a while. Now, if I had to do that again someplace else, I could probably do it faster because now I know what the steps are. But at the time, it was just, okay, everything is, is this going to be reinforcing our authority or not? Is writing this article, is talking about such and such a movie? And, it worked. And we, I could tell you, I kind of saw the path and I thought, well, okay, let's try it. Let's do it and see what happens. And it worked.
It did, because listen, and we'll talk about your uncle in just a bit, Ken Atchity, but I'm not a movie person. I never have been. I'm a book person. You hand me a stack of books and I'm in heaven.
Yeah, my wife's like that.
Yeah, I'll read the back of a cereal box if there's nothing else in front of me. But when I find a movie that I love, I'll watch it multiple times over time. But if I stumble into a movie that you don't have me in the first 5 minutes, I'm gone. So I'll be honest with you, I use Rotten Tomatoes a lot because I don't feel like wasting my time.
I got that feedback from a lot of people. And the way I always thought about it is, when you look at the audience of people that go to the movies, there's a huge amount of people that are in their early 20s, and if I was to look at it from, audience demographics, so to speak, you got a lot of people who are fairly young, don't have kids, can go to the movies anytime they want. Great. And I would always tell people, if there's a movie you want to go see that movie. Rotten Tomatoes should not be the only determining factor as to whether or not you're going to go see a movie. Because people would always say, well, what if I want to go see some movie that gets a low score. And I would always say, look, if that's the movie you want to go see it, right? Who cares what the critics think? All that Rotten Tomatoes does is tell you what the critics think of a movie. But as people get a little bit older, and this is not to say that younger audiences didn't pay attention to Rotten Tomatoes, but I found that, and we found looking at our audience, that our split for the demographic was at 35. So we had as many people over 35 looking at the site as we did under 35. And that's, as far as websites at that time were concerned, 15 years ago, that's a pretty old demographic. I mean, I say old, like if 35 is old, but that's a demographic that's a little bit on the older side. And what we had discovered was, at that age, people have kids a lot of times, or they're busy, or they're just working and they're deep in their careers, and they don't have just the time to just go see whatever. And at that point, Rotten Tomatoes becomes a really good tool to kind of sift through what's worth checking out. And I can't tell you how many times people would tell me, I wasn't sure about this movie, or this movie wasn't even on my radar, and it got 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's usually some indie movie. And I saw it and I watched it and I loved it. And that was the thing that always made me happy, because it meant that we were really serving the filmmaking community and really helping, especially indie movies, get a bigger audience than they might otherwise get. And that was always very rewarding to me.
I would imagine. As I said, I'm not a movie buff, and honestly, when I find something, I'll buy the DVD and watch it when I feel like watching.
Right.
But the last movie I was in, that I actually physically went to see, was Top Gun Maverick. And the only reason I went is because it was their opening. It was the opening of the movie, and I had not really heard of it, and I had never seen the first one. And I had friends over for the weekend, and they said, "Oh, we've got to go see that." And I said, "Why?" Because it was everywhere. It was all over social media.
Right.
So then we rented the first movie, on Amazon, and we watched it on my giant TV. I don't know why I have it. It's almost never on, but it takes up space in the living room. So there it is. But we were fascinated. So all of us, or I think there were 5 or 6 of us, decided the next day, which was a Monday, for some reason it was a holiday, and we went to the theater, and I think it was a holiday. Anyway, we went to a largely empty theater. All of us walked out clutching our heads and our stomachs, going, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." That is honestly one of the best movies I have ever experienced. Not seen, experienced.
You bring up a really good point, Denise. Certain movies, I think, are better seen
in
a theater on a big screen, right? Or at least for your first time. My son watches movies on his phone, and it makes me crazy. It just and look, like ultimately he's seen what I do enough, and he knows enough about film that if he makes that decision, that's fine. He's 20 years old. I'm not going to change his mind. But the film geek in me just thinks, oh God, partly because most movies are shot in such a way that they're supposed to be projected on a screen that's 20 feet wide, right? At least 20 feet wide. And, the photographers will tell you, and they know that the way something is displayed, like you shoot things differently, right? Like you film things differently. I feel like, at least historically, TV is easier to get away with on a smaller screen, just because of, the way that TV was shot for so long. And you have, and especially like if you look at old TV shows, and all their like tight close-ups, more than you necessarily see with movies. The shooting style, like kind of once you get used to it, you can start to see the little bit of differences in how TV is shot versus how movies are shot. Now that's changed within the last 10 years, because the TV producers and directors and writers know that everybody, so much of the audience has these big, giant screens at home that they can get a bit more cinematic, so to speak. but in the 80s and 90s, everything, we had all these what we thought were big screens, but if you think like, oh, I had a 30-inch TV tube, and that's tiny compared to the
Yeah.
big flat screens everybody has, right?
Right. I had a couple 30-inch monitors that I made dual monitors. I was so proud of myself until they got bigger and bigger and
Yeah.
bigger. And now I've got one on my desk that literally is like a 50-inch screen. It scares me sometimes. It really does.
Yeah, it's funny when I think about the differences in the way things look depending on the medium you're shooting for. I remember that was one of the first kind of knocks about Ron Howard as a director, because he came up in TV, right? He was on Happy Days, and before that he was on Andy Griffith, and he learned to direct on those sets, and he would start directing. And when he first made the jump into directing movies, I remember some reviews at the time said, yeah, his stuff looks like it's shot for TV. I just thought at the time, what a weird note that was. And then as I look back later, I realized, oh, okay, I kind of see what they're talking about here. Because the framing of things looks a little bit different. And he wasn't really necessarily making use of all of the canvas that he had on a big screen. But that's one of my little, I have a million stories like that about movies and TV. That's the tour guide in me again.
Oh, I love it. Didn't Ron Howard, wasn't he the director, produced, I don't know the differences, to be honest, for Apollo 13?
Yes.
Okay, see,
Yes.
that's
Which is,
another one of my favorite movies that I
oh,
did go
that's
see,
so
and
good.
I own the DVD. So,
You
and every
know,
4th of July it comes on. I don't know why the 4th of July, but every 4th we have to watch it.
that's a terrific movie. What's amazing about that movie is you go into that, and if you know the history, you know that Lovell and the rest of those guys making it
Right,
back.
right.
But Howard manages to make that tense, and you're on your edge of your seat the whole movie, even though you know how it's going to end.
It doesn't matter
Uh,
how many times I see it. I'm still like,
yeah.
oh, there's still a couple times where I still tear up. It's like, really, Denise, you've seen
Oh,
it 150 times.
yeah. But
It
that
gets me
doesn't
every
lessen its
time. No,
right, because it's still telling the story and still using all of those pieces uh, to get an emotional response out of you, and it still works.
it does.
You keep mentioning DVDs. I'm a big proponent of physical media, a big believer in people getting physical media, because in my head, if I want to own a movie, I want to actually own the physical movie, right?
Uh,
I don't want to be beholden to some company that may decide 10 years down the line, like, oh, we're closing up shop. Sorry, all the movies you bought are gone.
yeah, or they're reworking them because of woke.
Well, or just whatever reasons, right? Like sometimes it'll be, oh, we've changed this because, George Lucas has, went back a couple of times on the Star Wars movies, and okay, fine, he can do that. They're his movies, but I kind of like seeing the original versions, right? I like seeing things before they change. Like, there's a movie called Blade Runner that's people will argue as Ridley Scott's one of his masterpieces, and he's gone back and changed that movie 3 or 4 times.
Really? Never
Or
seen
he or
any
the
of them.
producers, or yeah, it's this Harrison Ford movie where it's set in the future where he's a detective and he has to find these androids that look like people, and there starts to become a question as to whether or not he's an android, and it's a very beautiful, thoughtful, moody sci-fi movie. But there's been production changes over the years that, for instance, one of the first things that happened was the studio at the time didn't think people were going to understand it, so they went back afterwards and made Harrison Ford do a voiceover, which nobody was happy with. And then years later, they re-released the movie without the voiceover, and then they re-released it with some extra scenes that had been shot but hadn't been included in the final cut of the movie, and they call that the director's cut. And so there are, probably 4 different versions of Blade Runner that you can find and get a different experience every time. And that happens with other movies. sometimes people go back and tweak things or whatever. Sometimes it's the effects. But I miss, I kind of like seeing what the original vision was.
Exactly. And some years ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago, I don't remember now, but there was a big uproar on social media about some of these famous movies that we all know and love, Wizard of Oz being one of them, that they were going to be edited somehow to reflect, the new way of thinking. I'm telling you, Amazon went nuts for a couple of days. People were buying those movies if they didn't already have them. Keep them safe. I was one of them. I was like, wait a second. You're not going to mess with my memories. No. So I went and bought up anything I didn't already have.
Yeah, I like having, like I said, I like having physical media because then I know that as long as my machine keeps working, then I'm going to be able to watch that whenever I want.
Exactly.
The thing that makes me nuts is, there's all these, every studio at this point has its own streaming platform, and yet some movies are not available to stream, and it just makes me think like, what are we doing here? Why do we have this? Yeah. Don't tell me you're going to have this great catalog of streaming movies and then some movies aren't available at all.
Yeah, I noticed that with Max. On the few times I don't watch Prime anymore because even though I use Prime because I like free shipping, but I will not watch Prime Video because now they want to put ads on it, which if I wanted to, I'd go back to television, which I don't ever do. And I don't want to pay extra for something that it's just not going to happen. Don't get me started.
Oh,
So
I
switched over to Max, and I'm disappointed in Max because their catalog is pretty limited.
It is pretty limited, and it's frustrating, right? I will admit that as a man in his 50s, I still love watching Looney Tunes cartoons. I grew up on Looney Tunes.
Saturday
right? You know what's funny? Recently, I read somebody had said that Saturday morning cartoons were a secret plot to allow parents to sleep in on Saturdays.
Well, yeah.
And I had never thought of it that way.
It's the truth.
Yeah. So I will still go and watch Looney Tunes cartoons. And the thing that makes me bananas is they're not all available on the Max app. They had a bunch. They probably had at one point, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of all of the cartoons that have been produced. And then they later cut that back by like half. And I think, why? And I sort of know why they do it, but I don't really buy the excuse that it's cheaper and they don't have to pay out as many residuals and blah, blah, blah. I don't really buy that as an excuse, because I want my Oompa Loompa now.
Listen, Halloween, I'm watching anything that has to do with witches and cats and pumpkins and, where am I going to get it? I had to buy the DVDs.
Right. Yeah, because then that stuff's not going anywhere, right?
Right.
Yeah, I was going to watch, I can't remember which one is it. I think it's the first Cannonball Run movie, which I have a soft spot for because I'm a car enthusiast and they have some good cars in that movie, not available to stream.
No.
And I can't think, but the sequel is, and I can't quite figure out why, right? I mean, maybe it's some kind of music rights issue, but I don't think that that's the case.
You need to get in front of this. You need
to right?
I mean, we have questions. We need answers.
Well, it's funny though, like speaking of musical rights, for a long, long time, you couldn't get WKRP in Cincinnati on home video because when they were producing that show, they were using all real music, right? Real recordings. And they never secured the rights for video distribution, later video distribution and home video. So for a long time, you just couldn't get that show. And then now I think you can get it, but they've put in kind of generic rock music on the spots where somebody like, Venus Flytrap or Johnny Fever are playing tracks. But it's not quite the same, right?
It's not. And if you try to watch it on YouTube, it's fuzzy.
Oh, yeah.
See, now I'm just getting mad. Yeah, I really don't watch much TV, but I know what I like and I know what sticks in my memory. I know what touched me that I can hear something, see something, and I'm right back
Oh
where
yeah.
I was, and that's changing. And I find that very, very sad.
Yeah, the thing that I find, Niece, is that there is so much more media competing for our attention that it's hard to look at things, anything coming out in my head within the last 10 years. It's really hard for something to kind of break through and become a classic. And,
Good point.
I a little bit wonder, I know some of it is my age, right? Some of it is I'm old enough that I'm not necessarily, I've had to admit, like, I'm not with it anymore. Um, when I see news stories about musicians and I think, I don't know who any of these people are.
Well,
Uh,
I'm that way about when the Oscars come on, just because live on social media. I have to for my clients, and they'll talk about, the parties and the actors in the movies. I'm like, what? I don't know who these people are.
yeah, even though I haven't, like, I'm still mostly on top of movie casts and to a lesser extent TV, but TV, the volume of people to pay attention to is so much more. Um, but with movie, I always think of it a little bit like in the sports world, right? Like a sportscaster may specialize in football, but you put him or her on a baseball game and they might struggle. There are some sportscasters who can jump into any sport and have a breadth of knowledge across all sports that's astounding. But there's a lot of people that really only focus on one sport. And so I a little bit think there's a similar thing happening with movies and TV. But when I talk about things not breaking through the classics, I think one of the things we've really missed that's happened as a culture is when a movie, and a great example of this is Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption came out as a movie, and I wouldn't say it necessarily bombed, but it didn't set the world on fire. It kind of came and went. But then it got picked up by the basic cable channels, TNT and TBS. And those basic cable channels there was an element of curation that was happening there that, before the ubiquity of streaming, if you had cable, you had TNT or TBS. And if you're flipping through the channels, chances are at some point you're going to find Shawshank Redemption. And that seems to get good enough ratings that they show it over and over again. And after a few years, suddenly everybody's had the chance to see it and realize, oh my God, this movie's amazing. And it becomes one of the highest rated movies on IMDb and one of the most popular movies on IMDb and a couple other places. And everybody sees it as a classic. That's really difficult for a movie to achieve now because we're not flipping through the channels anymore to see what's on. We are picking
Right.
things that are on. And
Yeah, I
that's
cut cable 12 years ago, I think. I'll never
I,
have it again.
yeah, I've cut cable a long time ago too, but I found that I miss the curation that
Oh,
someone's doing.
okay.
I
I wondered how
similarly,
I would see the ratings pop up and go, where are these coming from? And I
yeah,
never did it. I was not curious enough to go look at it, but I would see them and go, huh. And then I go do, cook something.
right.
So you have
Yeah,
to work hard to get my attention if the television's on. I'm not going to stay in the room.
right. And I think we have a lot of that going on. And I think the ubiquity of and not just social media, like we're all walking around now with a device that the vast majority of apps on that device, or maybe not vast majority, but there's a significant amount of apps on that device that are configured specifically to get our attention. Um, and if we're not careful, if someone's not careful, they become a slave to their device. But there's not, when I talk about the collection of media and the collection of channels that is kind of overwhelming us, social media competes with television, right? People spend as much time on social media as they used to just sitting around watching TV. And, again, back to my point about Shawshank, like there's not a path for a movie like that anymore. Not really. Where you can just kind of casually discover something that's on. Now, as a viewer, unless you're only watching basic cable, but in the modern world, it's stupefying to think that somebody's able to still do that, because at this point you're required to choose yourself, and there's too much choice and there's too much going on. And how are you supposed to know? Because everything tells you, all of the marketing is, hey, this is the best, this is great, watch this. And you don't know, who knows what to watch, right? I mean, that's where Rotten Tomatoes would, if I were going to loop it back at all, that's where Rotten Tomatoes, I think, could be really valuable. But yeah, I kind of miss that curation of being able to, I can't tell you how many times in these, like, I'll sit down and just think, oh, I wonder what's on. And I don't have that ability anymore, because I'm responsible for my own choices. And I am a little, I guess
It's
I was
work,
spoiled.
isn't it? It's kind
It
of
is work. It
you
is
have to
work.
go, okay, am I going to watch Max? When I do turn on the TV, and last weekend I decided to go back to some old favorites on, I thought, I just need a veg out weekend. I'm not working.
Right.
I'm not mowing the grass. I'm sitting on the couch. I'm reading books. I'm watching movies. And somehow and I avoid Amazon, which is, then I have to keep pushing buttons, down, down, down till
Right.
I get to max, which is annoying all by itself, to be honest. And then I went, oh, Rizzoli and Isles. I haven't seen them in about 100 years. I watched back to back for 2 days. It was enormously relaxing, blood, gore, all of it, but I didn't move. I don't know what was going on in my head, but I remember watching it and going, this cast is phenomenal.
Oh, it's such a good
The
cast.
stories are, oh my God, so well written. And I don't turn on enough, I would say, modern TV, because Rizzoli and Isles is not that new to even know what's going on. But I come across Hallmark movies. What the heck? It's like, really? People are still watching that trash?
Yeah.
Just, yeah, it's like, if you're not going to here's my thinking. If you are going to try to entertain me, grab my attention, have me thinking, have me maybe acting on something, you better put up your best bet, and they don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of, I almost want to say garbage, and
No, I'll say it. It's garbage. In the deep South, we call that garbage.
Yeah, right. And you go shopping at the Target.
Nuh-uh. I go Walmart.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, we had a stint, I think, where we had some great television being made. There was this era that, for the last 15 years, I think we had some really terrific television hitting, and I think that that's drying up. We're going to look back on, the teens as this kind of golden age, the second golden age of TV, with stuff like The Wire and Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones and House of Cards and all these great spectacular TV shows that you had networks just throwing stupid money at, and all the finance guys are finally telling the executives of these networks, like, no, this isn't making you any money. You have to go back to stuff that actually makes money and sell ads. And I keep thinking, yeah, congratulations, everybody. We've reinvented basic cable.
Exactly. And you were talking about older shows, because I bought up the ones that I knew were, probably good. When I probably about the time I shut off cable, so I bought, and I never can remember the one where it says you are being watched with I never can remember the name of it.
Oh,
With
not Twilight Zone, The Outer
no,
Limits.
no,
Oh,
it's with Jim Caviezel. I
oh,
know it. I just can never. I've got it. I've got the whole set in there. That is some great writing. Those are some, great stuff. Yeah. Then there was things like Numbers. That was good.
right.
Leverage, I enjoyed, as goofy as it was.
I
All of them.
I am really looking at getting into Leverage. I've heard a lot of good stuff about that, and I think I'm
The
going to really
second one
like
I
it.
haven't watched. The first one I loved.
Yeah, I think I'm going to get into that. It's on my list of things to go back and binge watch. Are you talking about Person of Interest?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's one of my
it
favorites.
took me a minute to
Yeah.
remember that.
I never can. I don't know why I'm stuck. I can see them in my head. I can see some of the scenes, but I never can remember the name.
That happens to me too. Or I know the name and I can't pull the file out of my brain. That's the
Yeah.
thing that makes
I'm
that.
getting, I guess as we get a little bit older, we have cheese brains, like Swiss cheese brain, just a
Yeah,
cheese brain. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, Matt, where honestly, you're going to have to come back if you don't mind, because we've got so much to cover here. Would you come back maybe later in the year and we can?
absolutely,
Okay, good.
absolutely.
Your uncle probably warned you. She does that on the radio. Don't tell her no. Just don't.
Oh no, I've done enough. I've done enough press, as you know, in my role as editor in chief of Rotten Tomatoes. I was also kind of the I shouldn't say voice. I was the spokesperson for the site, so I was doing a lot of appearances on local TV here in Los Angeles, and I would from time to time do a spot on CNN, and was doing a bunch of radio. And so people would say like, "Hey, can we have you back?" And you absolutely say yes. Right? It's super awkward on live, when you're making a recording. No, I'm done. This is terrible.
Yeah. And I'm waiting for that to happen one day. So this was fun, but I don't like you. Oh
Right?
God. It could
That
happen.
would be kind of amazing radio,
Uh,
though. Maybe not on your own show.
no, I'm already grabbing my stomach just thinking about it. But I wanted to, well, let's just keep on where we're at because I'm going to have you come back and we'll talk about just all kinds of things. But
Sure.
you have moved recently, and I mentioned your uncle Ken Atchity, who is, I've got three top favorite people in the world, and he's in one, two, or three, depending on the day, but he's always in that top three, and he knows it. So Ken Atchity is the founder of Story Merchant, and you have basically just moved over to Story Merchant, which is completely different from what you've been doing. You've effectively switched sides from being a commentator and a critic to now being involved in the production and the storytelling side of industry. So how does that feel?
Uh, it's wild. It's wild. I used to, for the most part, I didn't really like. I would follow how a movie was getting developed, and I could oftentimes tell if a movie's going to get good or bad reviews just knowing who's involved and kind of reading the news stories and kind of chatter that's coming out about a particular movie. But now I'm looking at the scripts. Now I'm looking at the stories before. Sometimes the books to be adapted into scripts. I'm looking at stuff before it even happens, and so it's this fun exercise to have input on that. And I'll tell you, Denise, Ken is someone I've always looked up to. With his history teaching and as a professor and everything he knows about writing and the history of storytelling and just about literature in general. I've always looked up to Ken, and there was a moment a few weeks back where he and I were talking about a script, and I made some suggestions that then ended up being put into the script. And I thought it kind of blew my mind that little me could make suggestions that Ken would think, oh yeah, those are great ideas. So it a little bit feels like I'm in the big leagues because I'm working with my uncle, who is one of the smartest people I know. And for him to actually say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, it makes me feel great. It's awesome. It's so cool.
He was born not too far from where I am.
Right.
So
Yeah.
he's in some ways a Louisiana boy. In many ways, he's not. He escaped.
Well, yeah, but I mean, with his mother, my grandmother, who was one of the greatest people I've ever known. Mirza Aguilard was just amazing. And she was from Louisiana.
Eunice, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. She and my uncle Wilbur, who was, I don't know if you ever heard of Uncle Wib, Ken's uncle, my great uncle Wilbur, was the orneriest man alive.
Was he the one that would tell a story and everybody would bail off the porch?
Yeah, I think, yes.
I think so
Yeah.
too.
And Uncle Wib was the kind of guy you could say, good morning, Uncle Wib. And he'd look at you and he'd say, well, if you think it's good, I can't help you.
Oh, oh. See, and I'll tell people, when I'm doing the pre-interview, because I'll jump on the pre-interview, and this goes straight to you and your uncle Wib. They'll say, "Hey, how are you doing?" I'll say, "I'm well. How are you?" And then I explain it's listen, in the South, when we say how are you doing, we don't really want to know. We just want we're just making,
Right.
nice noises, but
Right.
okay, let's get down to business. But
Right. Or
don't
at worst,
tell
we
me
just want
that,
to know.
yeah,
We just want to know, like, yeah, I'm okay enough to keep continuing this conversation, but
yeah,
nothing major is going on. Yeah,
exactly.
my mom is from New Orleans, and so I've got, similar to Ken, I've got some of that Southern blood in me, not just on my dad's side, but on my mom's. She is one of four, uh, and her mother was from Georgia and her father was from Mississippi. And again, my mom grew up in New Orleans, so I've got plenty of Louisiana experience of my own.
It's in many ways, it's a wonderful place to be. But right now, when summer is hitting us,
Oh,
and we're in the, I know, and we are, just smack dab in hurricane season, it really does feel like we live in the armpit of Satan's, in Satan's armpit.
you know,
We have two seasons, hot and hotter in hell. That's all
right.
we got.
Well, and as hot as it gets here in Los Angeles, I don't go outside and feel like I'm being hit in the face.
Right.
Whereas, someplace like New Orleans, you go outside and it's, I mean, the old cliche, it's not the heat, it's the humidity, but that's absolutely true. That humidity is, it's so sticky and like it's almost like you could, you could grab the air with your hands,
Well,
right?
you're being smothered by a wet wool blanket.
Yeah, that's
It's
exactly it.
hard to breathe. And when I first realized that if you, and this is back in the days when people were wearing Eggs pantyhose, nobody wears
Right.
anymore. But I realized fairly quickly that if you're in a meeting and you have to go to the ladies' room and you peel those things down, they're not coming back up. Doesn't
Oh,
matter what the air conditioner is in the building. Just cut them off and go back bare-legged. They're done. I'm not joking.
yeah,
We don't get dry. Oh, and Southern women, we rarely wrinkle badly because we never dry out.
right. Exactly.
We look
Exactly.
good.
Yeah, it's the type of place where just walking from the house to the car and you think, oh, I need another shower
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
now.
That can happen in the house with the air conditioner going
Oh
if it's
yeah,
bad enough.
absolutely.
Yep. I let my dog out this morning. She went, "Oh no." And she wanted to come back in. I said, "Dog, go." No.
Right.
I had to walk her out to the tree and say, "We're doing this because I'm not coming back here when it gets hotter."
Can't you see what it's doing to my hair?
I know. Oh, that's another thing. I've got very curly hair. And when it's like this, I need a power rake. I mean, it's just, it turns into Hagrid hair, but the food is wonderful.
Oh my God, it's
I
amazing.
know. I know. So let's go back to Story Merchant. So uh, I'm thinking, this is just a wild guess. I'm thinking that Ken has watched you doing what you do, and he knew or knows that you have insights to the industry that he probably doesn't have because you have had these different roles. Am I guessing correctly?
I think so. Yeah, I can look, in fact, some of the stories I've been reading, my immediate thought is like, okay, what's the reaction going to be to this? And not so much am I worried about how popular it's going to be, but more that's the shorthand for, is this story being told the best way possible? Right? Is this writer, for what they're going for, have they laid it out the best way possible? And so sometimes what's exciting about working with Story Merchant is it's early enough in the process where of the production process, before production, even because things are still being written, that I can help a writer really set them up for success, right? And set that project up for the best case scenario. I've seen plenty of movies with good scripts that are poorly directed or, poorly acted or just not executed well at all. even though the script is okay. Um,
Are
but
those
boy,
the
it's
ones that we see them and think, man, you threw that together in about $15. What happened?
yeah, exactly. But it's very, very rare that I see a movie that works, but the script has problems, right? If your initial script isn't good, it's almost impossible to save a movie. And
Well, I have to ask you, I hate to interrupt, but now I'm like, oh, I got questions. Well, I always had them, but now I really do. So if we're talking about, because I know Ken works with authors, but he also manages to get these authors into movies. I mean, he's not just hey, we got your book, we're going to publish it for you. Good luck, God bless. It's not what he does. So what comes first, the book, then the script, or the script, and then what comes first? I'm curious.
it can be both. It
Oh,
can be either. It kind of depends on the writer. I think that there are a fair amount of stories that Ken's working with that have started out as books or short stories. But then there's some that there's scripts from the get-go and may never become books, may just be scripts. Um, there are a few things that we're looking at that are uh, at the script stage or really just at what they call the treatment stage, which is basically the overview of what the story is going to do. In fact, there's one thing that we've looked at that's a sci-fi story that I actually think might be better as a video game than anything else because it's
oh.
this story is very deep and they've spent a lot of time on the lore of the story and what's happening around it. And in my head, as somebody who plays games, I think, the only way you're really going to explore all of this that this writer has put together is maybe put it in a game because that gives you so much more time as a storyteller uh, and really rewards players for finding all of the pieces that build the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would have never thought of that.
And I wouldn't either, except that I'm a bit of a gamer, not a hardcore gamer, but I play enough adventure games that uh, that's what that occurred to me. Yeah.
So is that going to happen? Is that under advisement right now?
So we've talked about it. I'm off the top of my head. I'm not sure where that particular story is. I'm one of my next steps is to find some game developers who may be looking for stories and see if we can make some introductions. And one of the fun things about this role is that it has the element. One of my favorite parts of working at Rotten Tomatoes was what I would call the schmooze factor, which was, going out and meeting people and making connections. Because a lot of times I would go to an event, a screening, a premiere, a comic convention, and I'm meeting other journalists and figuring out ways that Rotten Tomatoes could work with them. So now what I'm doing is, looking up who are the producers at a studio, who are these script buyers, let's meet with them, let's go and schmooze with them and just kind of get to know them and see what they're looking for and what kind of stories they're interested, go back to our catalog, say, oh, okay, this fits that bill, and does this need some tweaking, and really just kind of putting people together and seeing what happens.
I'm speechless almost. That never happens, by the way. I just wrote this down. I had to push my cat off of my notepad, but when are you going to write your book? You've got this amazing, I bet you Ken's saying, where's your book, dude? When are you going to write a book?
I'm one of those writers that will do anything to keep from writing. When I'm trying to write something, I will, the house will be spotless. All of my errands will be run.
Yeah, I know. I'm doing the
Yeah,
same thing. I'm trying to finish up my book, and right now my baseboards are immaculate.
right.
Yep.
Um, I have very little discipline, and what I haven't discussed with Ken really is, what it would take for me to actually write something. I mean, when I talk to Ken about it, he starts bringing up Faulkner, and I think like, okay,
No,
let's
we don't
let's
want
dial
Faulkner.
it back a little,
Yeah,
right?
we don't want Faulkner. We want Matt.
right? Like,
Listen to these stories.
mm,
You could write a book about the things that you're telling me.
I mean, look, I'm a storyteller, right? I like telling stories. You know, some people might call it a BS artist, but I like to tell stories, right? To me, like that is one of the ways that I really relate to people, and I know I have a rep in my friends of being able to tell really fun, hilarious stories. Um, yeah, I mean, I have a million stories about working at Rotten Tomatoes and meeting cool people. Like, probably one of my, I don't know if I mentioned this to you in the pre-interview. Did I tell you about meeting Colin Powell?
Yes, but
Oh
to
yeah,
the audience.
yeah. So when I was working at Rotten Tomatoes for a few years, I would go to the local Fox affiliate here in Los Angeles and talk about the movies that were opening. Uh, and it was great. It was super cool to do. Love doing it. You know, I'm a bit of a ham, so I love doing media. That's really fun for me to do. Uh, and I would meet other guests who were there for the show in the green room. And one day, Colin Powell walks in, and he had a book that he had just written. This is what's God, probably 10 years ago, 12 years ago. This was, you know, a few years before he had passed. And he had a book, and so they brought him in, and we're in the green room, and he says to me, he says, "So what are you here to talk about?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Rotten Tomatoes, and I'm talking about the movies that are opening." And he says, "Oh, my wife and I use Rotten Tomatoes all the time," which was amazing, right? To hear that from the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that they use my crazy little goofy site. Uh, and then he says, because it's at this point, we're about 2 weeks after the movie Battleship had opened, which was this, I don't know if you saw it, it's really dopey. You know, based on the game, right? Based on the board game, they made a movie. And so he says, "How is Battleship?" Now, I know that a guy like Colin Powell, knowing what he knows, is going to appreciate what I thought was one of the dumber things in the movie. And I say to him, "You know, it's really dopey." I said, "Not the least of reasons is that they would have you believe that they could get the USS Missouri up and running in about 4 hours." And he looks at me and he says, "Come on." And I thought that was it was so great to be able to talk to that guy who, of all people, would know how silly it was that a mothballed battleship could get up and running. Like, I couldn't tell, there couldn't have been a better person to tell that story to. Uh, and that was one of the really fun things about the job, was the people I got to meet and interact with who were interested in what I had to say, because I ran Rotten Tomatoes. So it almost, you know, it was more than just being able to geek out about meeting some person. It was, they actually were interested. My co-host and I had done an interview. We had scheduled an interview with Ben Affleck because we'd had a radio show on Sirius XM for a while. And we had 20 minutes scheduled to talk to him, which is a pretty substantial amount of time for an A-lister like that. And I think this was to talk about Argo, the movie that he had made. And he spent almost 15 minutes of our 20 minutes asking us how Rotten Tomatoes worked.
Oh.
Yeah, because all those guys want to know. I mean, that was the funny thing. You know, I knew Rotten Tomatoes. I knew we were making strides because 2 or 3 years into my tenure at Rotten Tomatoes, I knew that we could tell that directors of movies, especially, were looking at the site, because when a movie would come out, we would start getting calls from the publicists saying, "Hey, can you add this positive review to get our score up? Can you add this review? Can you add that review?" Nobody ever sent us a bad review to put on the site, shockingly.
No, really?
But I knew that was coming from the directors and the filmmakers who wanted to, you know, get their score up, because they knew that meant people would go see it.
So they were keeping their thumb on the pulse of who is paying attention.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Very smart.
Absolutely.
Very
Yeah. And then, you know, then I would have to explain to somebody like, "Well, that's not really a review. That's just an article about," I mean, that was a whole other, I mean, I could go on for 3 or 4 hours telling you stories about people trying to change their score, and some people that were happy with it and some people that weren't.
That's our next show.
Yes.
Seriously. You know what's going to happen? I'm going to get you to really, just give us all the goodies, and
Oh,
then you're
sure.
going to make that into a book. So tell your uncle, tell him
I
I'm on the,
will. I
I've
will.
got his back. So what happened? I mean, when you decided, I'm just curious, this is not quite personal, I don't think, but when you decided to go in a slightly different direction, was Ken approaching you? Were you approaching Ken? Was
You
it
know,
just one
he
of those, hey, we're eating together, it's time? What was
he
it?
had brought it up a few years back.
Ah,
Um, and at that point, I had some other stuff I was working on. And then, uh, about 8 or 9 months ago, I told him, I said, I think now is the time. Um, and partly I have, after I left Moviefone, I had worked at a marketing company for a brief amount of time and didn't particularly enjoy it. Um, and I thought, it might be time to be on the other side of it. As I look at the level that I was at running an entertainment journalism site, an entertainment news site, there's very few roles, there's very few jobs at the level I was at. And because there's probably a dozen jobs and probably 50 people fighting for them. And so rather than just kind of keep fighting for that, I thought, let's go in a different direction and do something else. And see if we can, see what it's like. And so I reached out to Ken and we talked about it, and we decided, yeah, let's get started.
well, I'm glad you did, because I mean, I think, and this is just me thinking, I don't know any of this. I don't have anything to point it to other than what you have told me, but it just seems to me that with all of this massive experience that you had on, as I don't know what TYT Network is, but Moviefone, what is TYT Network?
TYT Network is a news site that I
Oh, okay.
briefly was getting into news and then realized, oh, real news is awful. I want to get
Yes, it
back
is.
into entertainment.
Okay, good. And when you mentioned the word news, entertainment journalism, I had never heard of it, but now that you mention, I'm like, okay, I get that. I never thought of it like that. But you have massive experience in one arena, and now you can take that massive experience and put it in another arena and meld them, I think. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, it's interesting because I like to think about, I'm very much a person that I look for connections and things just in general. And um I think taking the things that I have learned and knowing what I know and kind of connecting the dots earlier in the filmmaking process just seems really exciting. And it doesn't occur to me that I have such a different perspective than Ken does. Because I still kind of look at Ken at like, well, this is the dude that knows everything. Uh, but when I'm throwing out like, oh, this would be an interesting cast for this particular movie, or this studio, there's a story we're talking about that he had trouble getting traction on, and I said, and I've pointed out like, well, with Shogun being such a hit, maybe maybe we should revisit this particular story that's set in Japan in a similar area, because now there might be more of an appetite for that. So that, some of that is like knowing what the landscape and what's popular right now in a way that Ken's not necessarily monitoring. Because I'm still watching 2 or 3 movies a week and I'm still following entertainment news. I just kind of can't turn that off.
Oh, you shouldn't.
Right. And so I'm looking at stuff from knowing a little bit, not that Ken and the rest of the team don't really know what's being produced, but I think I've got a little bit more of a sense of how the entertainment journalists are looking at things and how that can affect the narrative around a movie getting created and produced. And I think that that's something I really look forward to kind of zeroing in on and seeing how I can affect what's getting made.
I think that's amazing. And we're about to run out of time, and I'm going to have to reluctantly let you go in about 5 or 6 minutes. But before we do that, I wanted to bring up the writer's strike. I mean, the entertainment industry has recently faced significant challenges due to the writers and actors strikes. And then, of course, AI, there's a big uproar over artificial intelligence. So, what's your opinion on how the industry will fare in the aftermath of these events? And do you think it will recover, and when, or if? What are you thinking about all this?
It's. I think we're gonna. What I wonder about is what's the technology that's over the horizon that's going to change everything again.
I think that's the big question.
Right. I don't really have a sense of what AI is going to bring to the table. I think that if anything, you're going to see some AI happen around, and I use the term AI to talk about, like, I mean, we could have a whole other discussion as to whether or not this is true artificial intelligence, but the shortcuts, I think we're going to see some things that happen kind of in the post-production arena, and you'll see some kind of really powerful special effects. I don't know if you've seen any of those videos on this site called Sora that's experimenting with photorealistic imagery, and there's some film clips on there that, well, I'll tell you, Denise, that look like real people. And it's a little disturbing.
I thought that was CGI, or maybe because I'm thinking of, remember Titanic?
Right.
I mean, and I did see that one in the theater, but I could tell that those people on the ship were just painted on thingies. I mean, I know it was CGI, but they didn't look real to me.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a new level of realism in CGI. The question, I think it remains to be seen, is to, are writers going to get replaced by AI writing? I find that hard to believe.
I do too. And I'll tell you why very quickly, because look, I'm a nerd. I'm a techie nerd in stilettos. I bought my first computer before there was an internet. It turned out to be a $3,000 boat anchor, but I loved it. I still have the MS-DOS binders in my office. I do. I mean, I was a nerd before I knew there was such a thing. But I've watched everything change and grow and die off. MySpace, it's dead. It went away.
Right.
Things pop up, they go away, but they always, in my opinion, leave something lingering behind that can go, that wasn't a bad idea. Kind of like what you're talking about with Story Merchant. So but the whole AI thing, and I lost my train of thought for a second there, but when I bought my mom her very first computer, it scared her stupid. And I kept saying, Mom, it's a machine. You have to train it. And I think that's what people are getting away from. They're not training it. They're scared to death of it. It's a tool. Should it replace writers? No, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think that it will, but the goofy side of me looks at, if you've seen those videos from companies like Boston Dynamics that are making these amazing robots that can walk around and balance on two legs and move like crazy. And I think, okay, so we're working on those and we're working on AI. Did no one watch the Terminator?
I know. I actually came across that on Max the other day, and I tried to watch it and hated it, so I didn't.
Like, have we not learned our lesson? I mean, have we not seen enough movies where the computers take over? Come on.
Yeah, it's not like they haven't been around forever. Right. Lifetime, other people's. This has always been a looming thing. It's like, why are we not prepared for it?
Right. No, I don't see, AI generating stories that are going to resonate with an audience. I just don't see it. I think what you'll see is, you'll see studios and networks try and do something like that. And the backlash will be such, there will be backlash, but then there will also be that it'll just bomb. And somebody will make a movie.
Yourself, what do they have about people? I mean, why don't they like people?
They don't want to pay them.
Well, I figured that was it.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's it, right? Like, it's just that simple. right? The reason the studio wants to have an AI program write something is they don't want to have to pay the writers. They don't want to have to pay anybody. And it, I mean, I could go off on a whole rant about why NBA shouldn't be running studios or networks, but at the end of the day, that's where we're at. And you have, it might be cheaper for the bottom line initially if you don't have to pay writers. But if your movie,
their audience is just going to go, nah, I'm not coming back.
Right.
We have too many choices.
Right. But that doesn't, that's not the problem with the guy making the decisions. Because he's got his golden parachute. And as long as the stock is up for a couple of quarters, even if it tanks later because the movie's bomb, he gets to leave and he's still got his golden parachute.
Yeah, I'm thinking Disney.
Yeah. I mean, that's all of them, right? Not to sound cynical, but
I knew things were getting bad, but I also knew, as we both discussed, a lot of what is being delivered is crap.
Yeah.
We've moved from garbage to sheer unmitigated crap.
Yeah. I mean, there's still some gems out there. But yeah, I mean, look, like that's the the challenge with show business and the money around an artistic medium like that is, it's a tricky balance to get between, it's very hard, I think, for, anyone in this business to be able to balance artistic sensibility and remaining true to their creative vision as while also being in mind, keeping in mind the money, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, for every James Cameron who can make this movie like Avatar or Titanic that everybody thought was going to bomb, both those movies, and everybody said he was crazy, and both times sets new records. There's a million people who just do it for the money, and the movies turn out terrible.
And the audience knows that, whether we recognize it or not. At some level, we're going, "Why did you serve garbage to me?"
Absolutely. Yeah, we know. Well, and that's the thing I always said too. Like, look, we get the media we deserve. We get the media that we go and see and consume. And so if people are still making stuff, it's because somebody's watching it.
True. Listen, I hate that I have to let you go, but before we wrap up, this is fascinating and thank you. But before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners? Any final thoughts, advice, insights you'd like to impart?
I would say the thing that the two rules I kind of live by in a working environment is, number one, be curious, right? When I'm hiring an employee, or my most valuable employees are the ones that are curious. Why do things work the way they do? Why don't they work? To me, everything's kind of a problem to be solved, or not everything, but a lot of times at work and business, it's like, okay, well, how do I solve for whatever it is? So I think curiosity is important, and kindness. Like, I'd rather work with a kind group than anyone else. Like, I think kindness gets underrated, and I'm a big believer in that. So be curious and be kind.
I love that. Curiosity is one of the most important things in my life. I'm curious about everything.
Oh, yeah.
Where can people connect with you online? And you do need to come back. We have all kinds of stuff I've been taking notes. We have more stuff to talk about.
You can find me probably best on Instagram. I don't post that much, but posting pictures of my dogs. And you can find me just at matt.atchity on Instagram.
Gotcha. Well, listen, to our audience, as we conclude today's episode, your feedback means a lot, and I'm going to tell you why. If you found the show helpful, please support us with a quick review on iTunes, because your input is vital in my mission to inspire and empower more individuals. Don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a review, and share your Partner in Success Radio with friends and colleagues. And be sure to go find Matt Atchity on the web. You can find him, as he just mentioned, Instagram, and you can also find him and his work, I'm sure, over at storymerchant.com. And thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Matt, again, thank you so much, and I can't wait to have you back on the show soon.
Oh, I'm excited.
Thank you.
Get your voice heard. If you would like to launch your own far-reaching podcast, contact Denise Griffitts at yourofficeontheweb.com and go to the podcast tab.